At least we do, perhaps, until we look at that map up on top, which I hope you'll agree looks fairly similar to the one down here. One is the internet route and the other is the cable route. Now there's huge changes, obviously, in the way Asia has been brought into the world. But if you look at that aside, most of the routes and the densities of the routes look very similar then to what they did in those days. People were laying down, in many ways, the legacy that we live with. So what went on? We had a communications revolution. All right, we know that. It has some antecedents. Here, in fact, a good old friend of ours, Hooke, writing for the Royal Society, and saying, in this nice phrase, communicate one's mind at a great distance. That's how he sees it. He's not sending information, he's communicating his mind. And he thinks you can do it by having a system of high poles and hanging letters from them, so that people will see the letter at a distance and you can spell out word by word. Now that, in fact, prefigures what became, in many ways, the revolution, and where we get the word telegraph from this fellow Claude Chappe, the French experimenter who set up, and we discussed this, Jeff has mentioned it, I've mentioned it before, the line of sight telegraph. You would build towers, often on top of other buildings. And on top of the tower you would have this stick and these two little sort of poles that you could move around in different ways. And by jiggling them about, you could spell out letters. And with a telescope in the next tower, you could see them and write them down. And then you would put them up on the top of your tower. So the very first one that was created was from Paris to Lille, just after the revolution, and there was still a lot of perturbation in France. There were 16 stations, but they could get messages along them pretty well. And this, in fact, is the first message that was ever sent. And that shows you the shape of the signal on top of the tower for each of the words. The message was, in fact, that Condé had restitué la République seconde, which had broken away from the French Republic after the revolution, had now been brought back in. And word was being sent back down the wire that this was happening. And so that, in fact, is the first telegraph message. Chappe called it the telegraph, writing across distances. We still live with the word. And in fact, that was the beginning of what became an extraordinary national system. There were 5,000 kilometers and 500 stations going all the way around France. They were all interconnected fairly impressively. And in fact, this one intrigued me. I was actually driving across France not long ago, and I saw this old building which had been a sort of grand manor house and castle, which had this tall statue of the Virgin Mary or some such up on top. But it looked kind of interesting and suspicious to me, so I went in, and in fact, that had replaced what had once been the old telegraph tower, which used to stand on that very spot and was one of the high points of broadcasting around the country. As you can see from that message from Paris to Lille, and it's always the case with the communications network, our networks included, is that the first and most significant interest is likely to be, think of that message, what it was conveying, the message from Lille to Paris in the revolution, brought back into the fold. They tried to break away. Sorry? Well, political, yeah, but more than political. I'm not going to, Adam takes too many questions. Anybody else? Thoughts? Not political? What else? Who's the other great concern with national communications and international ones? Yeah. The military. All right, you two, I think I should forbid to speak for the rest of the class. Make these others work. Okay, so military concern drives the communication networks in many ways. If the French are doing it, then the English have to do it too, and they get terrified and they build their own system. They create a shutter telegraph to go from Portsmouth, which is where the Navy is based, to London and the Admiralty, which controls the Navy. And as ever, the monthly review, as soon as it up says, by telegraph, using the French word man, himself renders himself as it were present in the same moment at distant places. The annihilation of time and place, a phrase that we've heard before. So it becomes important over land, and of course, particularly if you have a naval empire, it becomes important over sea. So this rather splendidly loose chap, Home Popham, devises a system of semaphore broadcasting to send messages between ships. And those proud patriotic Englishmen in the room will have known of the Battle of Trafalgar. But in fact, it's been argued that the key to that battle was not the supremacy of the great British sailors or their wonderful ships. It was that they had a signaling system and could coordinate the attack during the battle, whereas the French ships, once it had began, were all on their own. They couldn't get messages back and forth. So that kind of messaging becomes significant. Okay, it's still what's known as line of sight telegraph. Powerful, can cover the whole of France, can reach across the sea. What are its limitations? Particularly if you're sitting in England. Are you allowed? I'll allow you to talk for the moment. Some of these people are going to do something like that. What? The weather. Okay, so here you are, you're in this wretched, foggy, cloudy, rainy climate. Your line of sight telegraph has certain limits if you can't see further than the end of your telescope. So people have been and start thinking more and more, how can we do this that's not in a line of sight way? Well, going on at the same time, lots of experiments in electricity. Again, a lot of them done in France. This splendid chap, Adet Nollet, who was a contemporary of and a great influence on Franklin, who was both doing work on electricity at the same time, how to generate electricity. And people at first are simply noticing there's a spark, and the spark jumps across the gap, and you can light fires with it. But he starts to realize not only that, but if you generate this charge, it'll go along at first. He's not quite sure what. So he manages to persuade 180 royal guards to link hands, and he puts a charge in at one end and sees how far along this. And because he's an abbot, and he's an abbot with religious control over monks who have to do what he says, he finally gets a kilometre of Carthusian monks to stand there. And so he's going further and further, and of course, in order to go further and further, he's generating bigger and bigger charges, and he stands there and looks very happily when, along the line, suddenly at the end of the kilometre, this poor wretched monk goes, ah! And it's great, yeah, that's scientific progress. But you have to have a lot of sad people who are kind of under your control to do that. But anyway, he started to show that this charge could move along a wire. And lots of people said, that's really interesting. And so we can say in the grand story of the revolution, along comes Morse. Morse is artist, for the most part, travels around Europe, but he has this idea. And he puts it quite nicely, the presence of electricity can be made visible. So not simply an electric shock that knocks you out, but in some way is made visible in any desired part of the circuit. I see no reason why intelligence may not be instantaneously transmitted. And so he develops what we think of now as the telegraph. He submits his first patent in 37. I'm going to go over this very quickly because it's just standard stuff. 43, he's able to set up with government support the Washington-Baltimore line. And in fact, it's used to convey the outcome of the Republican Convention, I think, the Republican Convention, that is being held in Baltimore, and who's going to be president is transmitted by this telegraph back. So it was a big stir in who are now we've got a long line, an established way of saying we can do this over long distances. Huge, huge triumphal success. And then slowly the Western Union is formed, we get the transcontinental telegraph, which comes to California. And that's part of what George is writing about in that piece I argue to read. The effect of the telegraph is everyone in California really wanted that. As George says, news from New York is news of the world to us. And he sees it vital for California to be able to stay in touch with the rest of the country. So there were huge celebrations when the telegraph finally came to the state. Because He's starting all sorts of different things. People get very interested in Morse. And so again, as we talked about corporations, people start to form alliances of one form or another with him. One of the interesting ones is with this figure, Sam Colt. Now, Colt we all know already because we know of the Colt revolver. He was a great inventor. So he begins with weaponry. He produces the revolver. The next thing he wants to do is to save America from attack by getting a huge government contract and being able to put charges out at sea to prevent against incoming ships. And rather than being just a mine which will go off when the ship will hit it, which would mean that your own ships might be in danger, he wants to be able to stand on the shore and press a plunger down and boom, the thing will blow up. So he and Morse therefore come to a certain interest. Why do you think they would each have an interest in the other? This is his job. What would he? He's very good with explosives. So what does Morse bring to the exchange? Sorry? The what? Remote detonation. And how? Keep going. Yeah. Right. So Morse knows how to send a signal over a wire. Colt knows how to cause a big boom. In fact, Colt has something that he gives back to Morse because the early telegraph wires were plagued with leaking signal. In part because Colt very much wanted to bury them. He thought if you put them up on telegraph poles, they probably wouldn't be safe. People would hack into them. So he buries them in the ground, but then they leak into the ground because he doesn't have decent insulation. And so Colt is able to provide some of that. But Colt is a guy whose eye is out for the main chance in many ways. And so he puts out this proposal in New York, having bought a license from Morse, Colt and Robinson now another company, the New York and Offing line of magnetic telegraph. And here the idea is to have, and this brings us back to that message that Dickens mentioned, being telegraphed in Boston. He wants to have a telegraph out here, on a proprietary line, he wants to buy so that no one else will have the right but him, to send messages back to New York City about what ships are in the offing, what ships are coming in. And that's what that quotation from Dickens was reporting. We are telegraphed at Boston. An outlying telegraph has sent in a signal that we're coming. Why would that be a good business? No, Michael, I'm not going to let them off the hook. We had these dreadful silences. So why would that be a good business? Think, you young entrepreneurs out there, you're thinking about what's the business opportunity in doing this? You all know about communications revolutions. What's the opportunity in that? What are ships coming in, if not carrying passengers, likely to be carrying? Goods. All right, step one. Okay, so what's the value of knowing that there are certain goods coming into the port? Sorry? Well, you can steal, but you're likely to be arrested for that. So if you stay away from that, Kate, yes? You can see what the market is going to do. You can try and corner the goods if you know they're valuable. You can short the stock if you know it's going to drive down prices. Once you have that information and nobody else has it, you can sell that information to other people. I mean, here is the essence of Bloomberg being built way back in the 19th century. All right, these are people saying financial information is really the key and we can do it. And so what he also predicts, and this is how I've looked at these for years at different times, this I think is the earliest prediction that a new technology will replace the newspaper. You may remember that we saw Théophile Gautier saying that the newspaper will replace the novel. Well now, or the book rather, and so now here on Tadros, he says, look, we're going to just wipe out all the newspapers in the country because we're going to be in charge of all the news that travels around. Notwithstanding that, in fact, as the telegraph comes along, the great user of the telegraph turns out to be the newspapers. And for most of the first 50 years of the telegraph, it was far too expensive for anybody else to use except for corporations, and for the most part it was newspapers. And so you get things like the Associated Press, starts partly in New York, partly in Chicago, and is formed to create a kind of monopoly of the news in many ways, and it starts to control lots of different newspapers. Now the history of the AP and the UPI is enormously complex, huge railway investments in it, huge fights, and again that's what Henry George is talking about in his piece, and every time we get to that. But so although Colt first predicts this is going to wipe out the newspaper, in fact it's the newspaper that really takes advantage of this new system. Huge consolidation around this when people see the power between Western Union and AP. I won't go into Sibley and Gold and Bennett, but these are important figures in the development. Okay, so very, very quickly, I've gone through the standard story, more or less, of the telegraph. It comes, invented by this one guy, spreads across the country, moves into business in a big way. Western Union develops, the rest, as they say, is history. It moves on, it's from there, in fact, it's people who are working at first on the telephone and saying, if I can send one signal down this wire, it'll be much better if I can send two, and looking at the process of duplexing, and then you go to quadruplexing, which is what Edison worked on. How many signals can we send simultaneously over a wire? Something which is enormously significant still today. They start to work on this, and one of the people who at first is working on this, and this idea of visible speech for the deaf, is this guy Bell. And he realizes slowly that, as people had known before, that if you can pitch it right, you can actually get sound across the wire. And if you can modulate it, you can actually get fairly well replicated sound. So there comes to the famous moment when he sends his message, which appears in a different form everywhere you see it, but more or less with the system, Watson, come here, I want or I need to see, to hear, to talk to you, whatever. And he sends a celebrated message. And now we've gone from telegraph to telephone. I actually like the account that what Watson says is, I could hear your voice plainly, I could almost make out what you said. Which is, it's not quite as smooth an experiment as perhaps we would like to believe. Now, here's a huge threat. Some people will say, actually, it's a backward step. Why might it be a backward step? Hey. This what, sorry? Okay, that's because written is more advanced than spoken. I mean, and in fact, that's a very good point, because a lot of business people in particular, resist the telegraph because they want the telephone, because they want written versions of their exchanges, which the telegraph gives them, the telephone doesn't. So that's one very good point. I thought that's why it's not. But also technologically, it's regressive in some way. If we look back from today, Tuesday mornings, or Thursday mornings. Well, one is that it's going to an analog system again. It was digital. The telegraph was digital. Now, digital, we're very nearly where we are in the late 20th century, but we go off on this long analog diversion because voice in some ways is much more seductive. The system is much more simpler, or whatever. People have, I won't go into all of these. The interesting thing again, if we look at the inventor and think back to the comment that the discoverer is not the best to understand what it will be used for. All sorts of ideas of what this should be used for, and that what we think of as the telephone is really not there at first. Bell himself thought of it possibly as a broadcast medium. He thought that he would play music over it and people would sit around the other end, or he would play sermons over it. So it was more like a line-to-line radio system. Hence it becomes significant that we call the radio the wireless, because this was a wired version. But all sorts of other wacky ideas before people really realized that this point-to-point, person-to-person communication. But that's one of the explanations given for why, in fact, Western Union, the telegraph monopoly by then, turned down Bell's patents, because they didn't see that it was really in their interest to have them. Okay, running right along, it takes off a little slowly, but once people realize how easy it is to use, how you don't have to go to a telegraph operator, it isn't as expensive as it was damn expensive, it takes off. And there's an extraordinary technological explosion. As you can see, it outpaces the car. At times, also races between the telephone and car. There are lots of problems. One of the main problems is to create interconnections. Because originally, the first idea is, well, I have to have a direct line from my house to your house if I want to speak to you. Well, that's a problem. So let's put a direct line to an exchange. But how then do we manage the changeovers in the exchange? And these become intricate technological and scientific problems. The work that leads to information theory in Bell, and the great Claude Shannon, who came up with the theory of information, actually begins, the mathematics behind it begins as people start to think of routing. Also, there are huge problems, which you mentioned already, about people listening into your call. Kansas, there were great accusations that a local funeral parlor had set up the phone exchange because they felt that the phone was so expensive. It was usually used to announce deaths, and they would therefore have the first word of who was death in the exchange. You could send off someone to say, well, use my funeral service. This is actually the first great exchange built in San Francisco. New Haven had the first exchange. So it's interconnections. Again, why is that in some ways an important model to think about for us? The word internet is an abbreviation for... Never thought it was an abbreviation, did you? You just thought it was a natural word. It came internetwork. And really the great work behind the internet was not building networks, which as with telephones was relatively easy, line to line. It was connecting different networks together. And that has all sorts of political and problematic ramifications. Okay, moving right along. So this stuff comes, first the telegraph, then the telephone, and the enthusiasm, particularly the telegraph, is enormous. This is the chair of the House Committee on Commerce, Fogg, who gets the report, the letter from Bell, lyrically enthusiastic. Bell, I think, asks for $26,000. Smith gives him $30,000. He writes a report saying this is the most important thing. It's a great and incalculable practical importance and usefulness of the country. Ultimately, the whole world would be presumptuous to attempt to calculate its usefulness. It's a revolution unsurpassed in moral grandeur by any discovery to the present day. So the politicians go ape for this stuff because it is so significant. Or if you come to the Patent Office. Now, the Patent Office is meant to sort of stand aloof and say, well, you have a right to a patent, but no more. But in fact, Ellsworth, who is in charge, in 1844, he writes this extraordinary account of Morse's contribution. It's brilliant, it's unprecedented, it actually throws a good light on the Patent Office that we were able to recognize its brilliance. It shows that all the people of Europe are so slow in comparison to the Americans, that our free enterprise system is better, the patent system is better. He just goes on and on. People think this is absolutely tremendous. So, towards the end of Morse's life, a statue is erected to him in Central Park in New York. After he dies, the Times goes into endless encomiums, this one about the great inventor of the world of a new method of imparting information, as he describes it. Huge, huge enthusiasm for this guy, because he really seemed to have changed everything that came along. And you can see the some precedent for this. We looked at this quotation by Claude Schaff at the very beginning when we talked about technological determinism, about how telegraph can bring an immense population together at a single point, and Morse is saying something like that. So he wants to say, though, that with this, the channel for those nerves which are diffused with speed of thought, thinking all the way back to Hooke there, knowledge of all that is occurring throughout the land, making one neighborhood of the, sorry, that should be whole, of the whole country. Okay, so again, enormous enthusiasm. So within the country, then internationally. The international telegraph is laid. They don't know when they send these messages that it's actually just about to collapse, so they get very excited about it. Buchanan sends to Queen Victoria, the Atlantic Telegraph under the blessing of heaven prove a bond of perpetual peace. And the Times says tomorrow the heart of the civilized world will beat with a single pulse. From that time forth, the continental divisions of the earth will lose those conditions of time and distance. The Atlantic has dried up, and we become, in reality as well as a wish, one country. So we've got the telegraph, and we just become united. This great theme. So peace is going to come to the world. Once you have interconnection, it's impossible that old prejudice and hostility should any longer exist. Steam was the first olive branch offered by science, then came the telegraph, enabled any man the reach of a wire to communicate instantaneously all over the world. And they go on and on. So we get these chain metaphors. They were facilitated with moral progress. The hand of progress, a rivet is loosened from the chain of the oppressed, and meanwhile, the great chain that will bring all civilizations into instant communication, etc. So you get the story. It's enormously, people are just delighted and excited with this thing and think it's going to do absolutely everything. So the Public Ledger, making an important point, says the telegraph, again, it's open communication now, being open to all, puts the whole community on a par. So social distinction will be taken away, and will thus head off the most adroit speculators because they will not have the power to monopolize intelligence. So everybody's going to use this, and there's no longer going to be any kind of this sort of creepy speculation. And the same thing comes with the telephone. I'm not going to go through all that story all over again, but you get this as Cartier, the head of AT&T, in 1891. Someday we will build a world telephone system making necessary to all peoples the use of a common language or common understanding of language, which will join all the people of the earth into brotherhood. There will be heard throughout the earth a great voice coming out of the ether, which will proclaim peace on earth and goodwill to all men. So, I mean, these are corporate bosses, but they feel that this is the story that they tell. So you get the picture of the reaction to the telegraph. There are two things that are seen as absolutely central. One is, here we have this great inventor, and we've looked at these in the past, but this is one who's really changed the world, who's really come up with something new, and the world is going to be significantly different because of it. And then, which is understandable, if we look at new technologies, we say, and it's going to be better because of it. This stuff will make us better. It's only the failure to communicate that has really kept us apart. Now that we can communicate, we're all going to be united as a single humanity with no divisions between us. Well, because you've been in this class with me for a certain time, you can imagine I'm not entirely going to endorse that picture of the world. We have to remember that they are the contemporary observers. But on the other hand, we need to ask some questions about those observations. Taking the first ones, you will remember that Ellsworth at the Patent Office said how enormously important Morse's thing was, both as a sign of the Patent Office of American invention and also of this individual inventor. So he gets tremendously enthusiastic. He gives enormous rights to the patent of Morse. Morse is given really any communication across a wire, more or less, any electrical communication, falls under his patent at first. So there's enormous, from what seemed to be this sort of scientific, technological guy in the patent office, huge, huge enthusiasm. The only thing he doesn't tell you is that he was hoping that Morse would marry his daughter. And he had an enormous interest in having a very wealthy son. Or we look at Smith, who writes the first and the second congressional reports, as I put up there, and as we saw, says how vitally important this connection is, what a wonderful invention it is, how it's going to change the world, and how indeed